This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
The men of the West. These are the arms of the province of Connacht, Ireland's western province. What is there about the West that's so attractive? The West of America, the West of Ireland, the West wherever it may be. It seems to draw out of us all that there is in us of poetry. And here, in a famous painting by Paul Henry, we have a good example of what the West of Ireland is. The West of Ireland is distant mountain, blue and purple. It's near mountain, impressive. It's water at the base of the mountain. It's cottages thatched and slate roofed, with the road running and twisting its way up into the mountains, and over it all, these huge, ever-changing masses of clouds. George Bernard Shaw said that the thing about the Irish scene that was the most interesting is, or was, he's gone, but is still the clouds. Now we're going to take you to the West of Ireland. It's a province that's smaller than many of the provinces in Ireland. We have Galway. You've heard of Galway Bay right here. We have the county of Galway, Mayo, and Sligo, which Yeats has made famous, and Leitrim and Roscommon. So this particular area is what we shall explore today. But before we begin the exploration proper, I think it's only fitting to say a few things about the city, the capital, if you will, of Connacht. That lovely, lovely, colorful, exotic, romantic, magnificent city of Galway. Now Galway, on the western coast and situated well in at the head of that bay, a bay that's 30 miles long. Now Galway is a great city in Ireland. Great, if not in size, at least in character. But though you may have been there, and though you may have come from there, I hope it isn't too much of a surprise to learn that although today it's the capital of what we might call Irish Ireland, we go to Galway because we want to be in the Irishest part of the country. Although that's true today, Galway's history is a history of allegiance to England. It was really once the outpost of England. Now, before we say much more about that, I ought, in fairness to Galway, say that at least according to tradition, it's a very, very ancient city. It's been there a long, long time, because on an ancient map drawn up by Ptolemy, that great Greco-Egyptian astronomer and geographer, whose Ptolemaic system we stayed with a long time in the West. Now, this astronomer of so many centuries ago, in one of the maps that he drew of Western Europe and on which we find Ireland, we find a city marked where Galway is today. So that probably and possibly there was a settlement there even in the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian era. However, we know Galway today as a much more recent settlement, as a 13th century settlement, if you will, when the Normans, the Anglo-Normans, and then the English came in and perpetrated aggression upon the O'Flahertys in particular. They stole, if you will, or they seized the O'Flaherty lands. And for a long time then, the history of Galway was a history of trying to keep what had been seized and a history of the attempts of O'Flaherty to get back. And as Galway prospered, it came to be the city of tribes, as it was called. There were 14 of these. And these were the descendants of the English and of the Normans. And in the 15th and 16th century, they were quite loyal to England. Later, they became quite Irish. But at this time, they were quite loyal to England. And chief amongst them was the Lynch family. There were others there, like Blakes and Joyce's, very famous name, of course, in this part of the country, and Martin and Kerwin. But all of these had the O'Flahertys to fear. And there was an ancient city wall. And over one of the gates was inscribed, over the west gate, as a matter of fact, was inscribed, "From the fury of the O'Flahertys, deliver us, God." So you see, what I'm saying was not mere legend, but really the history of medieval Galway and early modern Galway, say the 17th century. Now, today Galway is a seaport town. It has some light manufacturing, and it's also a delightful university town. Kate O'Brien, the novelist, may be quite familiar to you. In one of her books, she says, "Oh, to be a student in Galway is pure felicity." Well, I feel that way about the city myself, and perhaps many of you do. But we must eventually get there. So if you'll fasten your seatbelt, we'll fly you to Galway and move you along some of the streets of the city and also of the county, since it is both. And one of the beautiful things about Galway, really, is the swans that we find on the Corrib, right outside or right in the city, depending on how you want to describe it. The swans are so beautiful here, right in the midst of the city. But having seen them, perhaps we can move along to a spot beloved of the tourists. This is called the Spanish Arch. I think the notions of Spanish may be a bit romantic, actually. This is part of the old city wall. And there were two arches here, and one of them has been boarded up. It's sometimes referred to as the Blind Arch. It's a rather lovely and romantic place, but how much of that romanticism is connected with Spain is another matter. As we move along the streets, we come to Lynch's Castle, and there's a very romantic story about this, attested to, indeed, on the battlement itself, on the stone. But Lynch was one of the great families I mentioned to you, and he is supposed to have hanged his own son out of this window because his son was guilty of murder and none of the citizens would hang him. They had so much love for him. If we move to another interesting lane, Buttermilk Lane, which is near the Gaelic Theatre. Galway boasts a theatre which is all Irish. The houses that you see here, this is romantic. It looks a bit like Paris. It's Buttermilk Lane in Galway, though. And the tenements here figured in one of Walter Macken's plays called Mungo's Mansions. But I think we'll have to leave the city and journey to some of the scenic and romantic countryside, something like what you saw in the painting. This is near Costello, and this water and these roads and the stacks of turf and the stone walls and above all the mountains in the background, so typical of Connemara. The mountains indeed, you must look at those for a moment. These are the famous 12 bens, or 12 mountains, 12 peaks, the Bannabola, as they're called in Irish, or the 12 bens. Beautiful and lovely and romantic. Mountain, water, cloud, earth and sky meet in Connemara, magnificent and utterly out of this world. Then we come to something, however, that's so practical, right down to the bedrock indeed. What you are looking at are potato beds. Notice the trenches dug between the rows. And notice the profusion of rock. Because when you live in Connemara, when you live in Galway and Mayo particularly, you have rock, rock, rock. You contend with this. And notice here how the heather triumphs over the rock, coming up in its own vitality. But this area is historical, particularly with associations with modern history. This is the house of Patrick Pearse, the founder of the modern Irish state, really. And this is the place to which he came for his summers and as much free time as he could get. And this is the area from which he drew his inspiration for his poems, plays, and short stories. Other scenes are old and interesting. This is the west doorway of St. Brendan's Cathedral in Clonfert, which is near Ballinasloe. Now, for us as Americans, it's very impressive to be told that this monastery was founded around the year 560, quite a while ago. But notice the doorway. There are 6 recessed orders there. You can count them on your screen. And although you can't see the grotesquerie of the capitals, they are there. The monastery, unfortunately, of course, was wrecked in the 16th century. And as you go through these mountains, you come to this charming village, which is set like a jewel in their midst. This is the village of Clifton, and it seems remote from everywhere because of the mountains and sky, and yet the first wireless station in Europe was operated here, and only a couple of miles from here, the first flight across the Atlantic from the Western Hemisphere crashed here in June 1919. And in these mountains, we have very pleasant thatched cottages for those of you who like the sheen of gold on the landscape. And we have, of course, any number of these beautiful lakes which girdle this large mountain chain in Connemara. This is Ballynahinch Lake. And possibly I should tell you a little story about the Martins, because this area was the Martin family area, and the best known of the Martins in recent years was the man called Humanity Dick, who was a member of Parliament and one of the promoters of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Well, as I said, there's more than one of these mountain lakes, and this is Loch Aina, likewise part of that chain that girdles these mountains. And if Melville was right, that meditation and water are wedded forever, here in Derry Clare Loch, we ought to be able to prove it, I would suppose. Some of you have undoubtedly seen Connemara marble, and some of the best quality Connemara marble is quarried near here. And Thackeray, of the last century, described this place quite touchingly. Of course, when you think of Galway, you have to think of those islands off the coast of Galway. This is one of the 3 islands of Arran. This young man is sitting in what is called Synge's chair, because this is the island about which John Millington Synge wrote Riders to the Sea. Well, on those islands we also have antiquities that are associated with the early Christian church, such as these huts, clachans, or beehives, which were inhabited by the hermits of the 5th and 6th century in Ireland. And these islands have also, even today, their own customs and habits, such as this young man's fashioning what is called a kris, or an Irish belt. These are made of wool, and they're extremely attractive and bright colors. Well, we'll have to get you back on the mainland and look at some of the valleys in between these mountains and get ready indeed for our departure from the county of Galway and moving us into another county. Now, we have traveled a bit around the county of Galway out to the islands. We're simply moving north into what we call the Joyce country. Joyces, there are other names too, but this is a very famous name in that part of the country. We're moving into the county of Mayo. Mayo simply means the plain of the yew trees, Mayo. However, there's, I think, an interesting story in connection with Mayo that we'll take a minute out for. You remember Lindisfarne, that great monastic settlement off the eastern coast of England. And you know also that it was Irish monasteries, Irish monks who operated there for quite a long time. One of them, St. Colman, in the middle of the 7th century, in the middle of the 7th century, left in a little bit of a huff because one of the ecclesiastical synods, that of Whitby actually, had legislated against the Celtic traditions. So St. Colman left Lindisfarne and went back to his native country, settled on one of those islands. You saw that little clachan, that little beehive, settled on in such a hut or a house, and continued his community. I should say that 30 of the monks of Lindisfarne, both Irish and English, came with him. But a little difficulty developed. The Irish and the English monks couldn't get along too well. This is historical. So that Colman had to found another establishment, and this he did in Mayo. So this was called Mayo of the Saxon. That was the establishment that he erected for them, and remained a flourishing monastery for many centuries. Well, we are going to Mayo, a rather beautiful section of the country, and one that deserves indeed as much time as we can give it, which isn't as much perhaps as it should have. And this is the lovely River Moy in Ballina. This is on the estuary of Killala Bay, and I'll tell you a moment something about Killala Bay. This particular town of Ballina was the first town captured by the French when they landed in Killala Bay. And here is Dhu Loch, or Dhu Loch, which is only 1 3/4 miles long. Dhu Loch in English means black lake, and I suppose it's black from the shadows of the mountains cast upon it. Otherwise, it's quite attractive. But here now is a much larger one of these lakes, Loch Conn. And beyond it, a mountain that is famous in fable and in history, the mountain of Naifin. This mountain is associated in the old stories with Finn McCool and the Fianna who used to hunt upon it. And of course, in Christian tradition, it's associated with St. Patrick. Now, this lake and an adjoining one are connected by a short stream. And this is curious. The stream flows in either direction depending upon the conditions. That is, the water in each of these lakes rises and falls, but at a different time. And therefore, depending on which is higher and which is lower, the stream connecting them flows in that direction. But it's a beautifully wild and yet a sanctified section of the country. Here is one of the wayside shrines, this one in Ballintubber, and right across from the ruins of Ballintubber Abbey, an abbey that was built in 1216 by King O'Connor, King of Connacht, and destroyed by the Cromwellians in 1653. Of course, the Cromwellians did the same thing in England. They didn't expend their energies in this direction, only in Ireland. And this area is not far from the lovely, widespread, 10 miles long Loch Mask, with this gently sloping countryside running down to it, and with its winding roads and, again, cloud formations. And when we think of Mayo, of course, we have to think of Croagh Patrick, this mountain which dominates a large part of the landscape, and which again, in fable and legend and history, is a storied one. An annual pilgrimage climbs to the height of this on the last Sunday of every July. So we must begin to leave another county, and we leave the county of Mayo by way of these woolen mills in Foxford. Foxford is a town in Mayo in which these industries have been established by the nuns in order to give employment. So that Foxford woolens, and especially their blankets, are really famous all over the world. So we've taken two of these seaboard counties, and we move up to a third where we begin to turn in here. And this is the county Sligo. And of course, every Yeats enthusiast knows Sligo. Sligo was on the map before Yeats was, but I suppose we can say that he re-established it on the map. It's a beautiful countryside too. I think that Loch Gill, which he wrote about, so, well, should I say touchingly, or should I say too flatteringly, or what? Loch Gill that he wrote about in the Lake Isle of Innisfree, you will see in a moment, and it's a lovely place indeed. So now we are in Sligo. We have moved a little bit north, and we are now to partake of what Sligo can offer us in a hurry. This is Sligo Abbey, and a Dominican abbey, which was destroyed again by the Cromwellians, unfortunately. A beautiful establishment indeed, and the O'Connor burying place. This is an area of the country where the O'Connells, the MacDermots, and the O'Donnells enter greatly into history. And here is our Loch Gill, 5 miles long with several islands, one of the most romantic and attractive, really, of Irish lakes, and tremendously rich in antiquarian sites along its shores. Here, of course, we have some students from the International Yeats School looking out to that Lake Isle of Innisfree that Yeats sang of. And not far from our site is Ben Bulben. This we all know too from our Yeats poems, and it is on the slopes of this mountain traditionally that Diarmuid died. And then we come to Yeats's grave within the shadow of this mountain in Drumcliff, with the inscription of his own hands, "Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by." And in this same area we have Lissadell, the birthplace of Eva Gore Booth, the poetess, and of Countess Markievicz, the 1916 revolutionary. And indeed, this latter woman was the first woman to take a seat in Parliament in either the United Kingdom or Ireland. and she was elected in Ireland in 1918. And the last of the Yeats relics, and our final visit to Sligo, if you will, is this beautiful mountain of Knocknarea. This is the reputed burial place of Maeve, and you remember that poem, "The wind has bundled up the clouds high on Knocknarea and thrown the thunder on the stones for all that Maeve can say." That is Maeve's traditional burying place on the top of that mountain. Well, now we have finished too quick a tour, really, of Sligo, and we must finish off with two of the counties which, although they are attractive in themselves, have had a little bit less promotion, unfortunately. So that we move to Leitrim and Roscommon next. And in Leitrim, we have this lovely village on the Shannon. This is Carrick on Shannon, a center for fishing in the Shannon and in the neighboring lakes. And that's not fair to Leitrim, but as I indicated, we have to move on to Roscommon Castle. This is the largest castle to be found in either England or Ireland, a 13th century castle, now in ruins too. But Boyle Abbey in Roscommon is indeed a great treat, a Cistercian abbey of the 12th or 13th century. The MacDermots had their burying place here. It too was destroyed by the Cromwellians. Unfortunately, so much of this destruction has been repeated over and over again. But even today, it's a joy to behold, and it will reward your visit. And our final stop in Roscommon, the Loch Key, or Loch Kay, one of these beautiful lakes. Ireland is filled with them, particularly in the western counties. And this one in particular, one of the islands in this was the principal seat of the MacDermots. So we've had a very quick trip then around this section of the country, the province of Connacht, the west of Ireland. It's lovely, it's romantic, and it's historical. And I think since I've mentioned to you the name of Maeve, I'll conclude by telling you quite briefly, in case you haven't come across it. Maeve was an ancient queen who ruled in her own right. She had a very obliging and acquiescing husband, I suppose. She got into an argument with him one night, comparing their respective measures of wealth, and she found that he was the richer by a magnificent bull. Now, this shouldn't be too funny. In our day, we've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for good bulls. And because then she coveted one that was in the north of Ireland, in Ulster, she sent her armies there after it. Eventually, this leads to the whole Cuchulainn cycle, which is the Iliad of Ireland, and I leave it up to you to read it for yourselves.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.